An elderly black man stands quietly in the VIP line at a bustling airport. A white staff member storms over, screaming at him to know his place. The room goes silent. Passengers stare. Before anyone can react, the old man reaches into his jacket and pulls out something gleaming. A Medal of Honor. What follows next reveals 70 years of buried racism, bravery, betrayal, and a country's debt to one forgotten hero. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The automatic glass doors of Chicago O'Hare International Airport hissed open, exhaling a gust of conditioned air and the subtle aroma of roasted coffee and jet fuel. It was a late Friday morning, just shy of noon, and the terminal pulsed with the usual chaos of weekend travelers, families herding children, business people pacing with earpieces, and tourists glancing anxiously at departure boards. Amid the noise and motion, one figure moved slowly, deliberately. He stood out, not by color or presence, but by contrast. An elderly black man, likely in his late 80s, shuffled into the terminal. His back was slightly bowed, shoulders drawn forward not in weakness, but from years of quiet resilience. He wore a well-pressed brown overcoat, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and carried an aged olive duffel bag that had seen more of the world than many of the passengers crowding the airport today. His shoes were polished, though their soles showed wear. Every step he took seemed intentional, measured, not just by age, but by memory. He wasn't a man unfamiliar with movement, with waiting, or with watching the world judge him before he ever spoke a word. He moved toward the Delta VIP Sky Priority line, which was shorter, more exclusive. A sign indicated it was reserved for first-class travelers and elite loyalty members. No one noticed him at first. He took his place at the end of the queue without fanfare, but as the minutes passed, whispers floated like fog in the air behind him. A woman with a designer purse 2 spots ahead looked over her shoulder. She elbowed her husband, who glanced quickly, then whispered something back. The couple didn't say anything aloud, but their eyes said everything. The woman's expression tightened as she leaned slightly forward, using her handbag to create a physical barrier between herself and the old man behind her. To his right, a middle-aged man in a tailored navy blazer stepped out of line to double-check the sign, then looked at the elderly man and frowned. He didn't say anything, just stepped back in, now visibly irritated. It wasn't the first time Elias Monroe had felt eyes cut through him like glass. The receptionist behind the Sky Priority counter, young, white, mid-20s, noticed him too. Her gaze dropped from his face to his coat, then to his shoes. She scanned the bag he carried, the worn canvas too modest for a VIP traveler. Her expression registered subtle suspicion, then, as though on cue, sharpened. She gestured to her coworker, a lean, stiff-looking man in a navy uniform, and whispered something while pointing discreetly in Elias's direction. The man, maybe in his early 30s, squared his shoulders and walked briskly toward Elias. "Sir?" he called out, tone clipped. Elias looked up slowly, offering a polite nod. "Yes, son?" The staffer didn't return the gesture. "This line is for VIP travelers only. You'll need to use the standard queue, back that way." He motioned to the long, snaking line of economy passengers 30 feet away. "I understand," Elias said gently, "but I believe I belong here." The staffer's jaw stiffened, clearly not expecting a challenge. "Sir, I'm telling you, this is for VIPs." Elias didn't flinch. "And I'm telling you I know where I'm standing." By now the exchange had attracted attention. The woman with the designer purse turned fully around. A teenager nearby removed his earbuds. Even a pilot passing by slowed to glance. The staffer's voice rose, louder than necessary. "Look, I don't want to cause a scene, but you don't belong here, sir. You need to step out of this line right now." The sentence, though framed with faux politeness, carried weight. It wasn't a request. It was an accusation, wrapped in customer service language. The words struck harder than they appeared on the surface. "You don't belong." Something about that phrase fractured the room. Conversations halted mid-word. Every head turned. In that moment, time felt suspended in the charged stillness of terminal chaos. Elias remained quiet. He didn't protest, didn't raise his voice. He didn't remind the staffer of his rights, or of the ticket in his coat pocket. Instead, he lowered his bag gently to the floor. The silence was heavier now. The staffer's face began to flush, though whether from frustration or the weight of judgment pressing in from watching eyes, no one could say. Elias slowly reached into the inner pocket of his coat. His hand moved with reverence, like he was reaching into memory, not fabric. His fingers closed around something cold, metal, and sacred. He drew it out with slow, deliberate grace. What emerged wasn't a wallet or an ID card. It was a metal tarnished at the edges, but unmistakable. The blue neck ribbon, the gold star suspended from it, radiated quiet power. The Medal of Honor. There was a collective intake of breath in the terminal. Even those who didn't immediately recognize the significance of the medal felt its gravity. The staffer's mouth opened slightly, words failing him. A TSA officer watching from across the room began walking toward them, his pace cautious, eyes fixed on the gleaming metal. Elias didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply held the metal at chest height, allowing the sunlight pouring through the terminal glass to reflect off its polished surface. The room, filled moments ago with self-righteous discomfort, now stared into the reflection of its own assumptions. Passengers looked away in guilt. The woman with the purse dropped her gaze to the floor. The man in the blazer rubbed his neck, suddenly aware of how small he felt. The staffer stepped back, stunned, unsure how to proceed. And then Elias did something no one expected. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile triumphantly. He didn't even make eye contact. He simply lowered the medal back into his coat pocket, picked up his old duffel bag, and stepped forward in line, one foot in front of the other, measured, dignified, unshaken. The staffer remained frozen in place. But the story didn't end there. Just as the crowd began to breathe again, thinking the moment had passed, the TSA officer arrived. He stopped Elias gently, hand raised. "Sir, may I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. Elias tilted his head, a subtle frown creasing his brow. "About what?" The officer's eyes shifted toward the front counter, then back to Elias. "There's been a report. Someone raised a concern. I need to ask you to come with me." A murmur spread through the terminal like wildfire. Another accusation. Another subtle betrayal. The Medal of Honor now felt like a shield turned thin. Elias looked around, not with fear, but with disappointment. Again, he followed the officer without a word, but just before he stepped out of the line, Elias turned to glance back at the staffer who'd tried to shame him, and saw something chilling. The man was on the phone, whispering frantically, his eyes darting toward Elias. The words background check and suspicious activity hung like poison in the air. Something bigger was unfolding. And it wasn't just about the VIP line anymore. For one charged second, the entire terminal existed in a strange limbo, motionless, breathless, heavy with revelation. The Medal of Honor hanging from Elias Monroe's hand glinted beneath the sterile white glare of fluorescent lights. It wasn't just the object's shine that froze the crowd, it was the meaning, the weight, the sheer dissonance of their assumptions unraveling in real time. Even those unfamiliar with military honors knew instinctively. This wasn't a trinket. It was sacred, revered, something earned only through unthinkable sacrifice. The young staffer's lips moved, forming words he couldn't seem to say. Around him, travelers who had moments ago questioned Elias's presence now stared with disbelief. But Elias had already lowered the medal. He didn't bask in the shock. He didn't soak in their silence like victory. He simply stood, tall despite his years, proud despite their prejudice, and waited as the TSA officer gently motioned him aside. The airport hadn't just frozen. It had bent under the weight of its own ignorance. Elias followed the officer without protest. His steps, slow and deliberate, whispered through the polished floor. A subtle limp began to show, one no one had noticed in line. It wasn't dramatic, but it told a story of old wounds never fully healed. He was led through a glass hallway that overlooked the tarmac. Planes lumbered across the runways below like metal beasts, their engines screaming. But inside the hallway, all was still. "Sir," the officer finally spoke, his voice unsure. "I'm sorry, but a concern was raised. I'm going to need to ask for your identification." Elias opened his coat again, not for the medal this time, but for a small, cracked leather wallet. He handed over his driver's license and a military ID card that looked older than the officer himself. The name printed in bold, Elias James Monroe. Date of birth July 14. The officer studied the ID in silence. Elias studied the floor. "Mr. Monroe," he said slowly, "you're a Medal of Honor recipient?" Elias looked up. "That's what it says, doesn't it?" The officer nodded awkwardly, visibly wrestling with discomfort. It's just that there's no official file attached to your TSA record. Usually, Medal of Honor recipients are flagged for special protocol. Elias let out a dry laugh, not from humor, but from a deep, weary irony. Son, if the government kept good track of black soldiers, this country would have looked a lot different by now. The words hung heavy, and the officer said nothing in return. Elias turned away, his eyes settling on a distant horizon outside the window. And just like that, the hallway dissolved into memory. Korea. Snow fell in thick, biting waves. The mountains were bone white, and the cold clung to everything like punishment. 19-year-old Private Elias Monroe moved through the frozen wilderness with bloodied boots and frost-bitten fingers. His unit, a 76th 81st Infantry, all black, under-equipped and forgotten, had been cut off behind enemy lines for nearly 2 weeks. Food was low, ammunition, lower, morale, barely breathing. But Elias had something that couldn't be measured on paper. Conviction. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the fastest, but in the darkest moments, he became the one the others followed. Not because he had rank, because he had heart. On the 12th day, a distress signal came through. A group of white soldiers from the 3rd Infantry had been ambushed and were trapped in a valley 2 miles east. Their commanding officers had fled. The weather was too harsh for air support. Orders were clear: hold position, do not engage. But Elias didn't believe in orders that left men to die. Against direct command, he gathered 7 volunteers. They moved by night, navigating snow-laced ridges with only pocket maps and memory. When they reached the valley, it was worse than imagined. Dozens of wounded men lay exposed, surrounded by North Korean snipers. Elias's team split into 2 units, drawing fire with homemade decoys while Elias himself crawled through mud and blood, dragging the wounded out, one by one. 73 soldiers. That's how many he carried, bandaged or shielded with his own body. The rescue lasted through the night, and well into the next day. By the time reinforcements arrived, Elias had collapsed from exhaustion, his body riddled with shrapnel and hypothermia. His hands were torn, his uniform soaked in crimson, but every single soldier was alive. He awoke in a field hospital days later. A nurse told him he'd saved more lives than anyone else in his division. She said a general had come to visit, promised honors, recognition. The country will remember you, he'd said. But then, silence. No citation, no medal, no mention in the military press. 3 months later, Elias was discharged for insubordination and reckless conduct. The mission had violated direct orders, they said. He had endangered his unit. Never mind the lives saved. Never mind the white officers now being praised for heroism. They hadn't earned. He watched from a hospital cot as a major named Clifford Ray Daniels, the same man who had originally refused to send help, received a Silver Star for commanding the emergency rescue of trapped forces. Elias wasn't even invited to the ceremony. His name disappeared from the official after-action reports. When he inquired, the army told him there had been an error in paperwork. When he pushed further, a lieutenant quietly warned him to stop asking questions. So he did. But he never forgot. Back in the present, the TSA officer stared down at Elias's ID, still processing the weight of what stood before him. "Mr. Monroe," he said softly, "I'm going to apologize. I think there's been a mistake." Elias turned back from the window. His expression wasn't angry. It was tired. "Son, mistakes don't last 70 years, unless someone wants them to." The officer handed the ID back. "I'm going to walk you back to the VIP area myself." Elias didn't answer. He simply nodded. They walked side by side through the terminal. And as they passed the crowd, still gathered near the VIP line, people stepped back instinctively, their faces now painted in awkward admiration, not disdain. The staffer who had originally raised his voice looked down at his shoes. But Elias didn't look at anyone. Not in anger, not in triumph. He had seen more than shame could offer, and more than praise could repair. And then, just as he was about to re-enter the line, a sudden voice cut through the speakers. "Mr. Elias Monroe, please report to Delta Security Services immediately." Heads turned again. The voice repeated itself, more forceful. "Mr. Elias Monroe, Delta Security. Immediate response required." The TSA officer looked confused. That shouldn't be happening. That's not standard." Elias closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, a strange chill spread through his chest, not from fear, but recognition. It was the voice on the intercom. He had heard it once before. It belonged to Clifford Ray Daniels, the same officer who had buried his name 70 years ago. The voice echoed again over the airport intercom. Crisp. Controlled. Cold. Mr. Elias Monroe, report to Delta Security Services. Elias didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Because that voice, the clipped, rehearsed tone, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was him, Clifford Ray Daniels. The man who once wore brass bars and a paper smile while erasing Elias from history. The man who took the glory and left Elias with a dishonorable discharge and a fractured body. And suddenly, everything around Elias blurred. The airport dissolved into soundless haze. The present folded in on itself, peeling back like a memory hidden beneath the floorboards. And there it was again. Alabama, before Korea, before the battlefield, before betrayal, before he was a name that whitewashed reports chose to forget. Elias Monroe was just a boy with calloused hands and dirt under his fingernails, running barefoot across sun-scorched fields outside Tuskegee, Alabama. The town was a patchwork of poverty and pride, a place where black folks carved dignity from dust, where children learned early the difference between justice and what the law allowed. Elias was the son of a sharecropper. His father, Jonah, worked a stretch of borrowed land he'd never own, in exchange for a wage that never arrived on time and a debt that somehow always grew. His mother, Sadie, ironed the clothes of white families across town, families who wouldn't let her use their bathroom but trusted her to raise their children. Elias grew up hearing two sets of rules, the ones they taught in school, and the ones you had to learn to stay alive. Never look a white man in the eye too long. Say sir, even when they don't deserve it. Keep your hands where folks can see 'em. If a white woman lies on you, don't run, pray. He didn't know what racism meant, not in textbooks. But he knew it in bruises, in silence, in how white kids laughed when his little brother was denied a soda from the drugstore counter. At 17, Elias had plans. Small ones. Honest ones. He wanted to become a mechanic, maybe open a shop of his own. He had a gift with broken things. Bicycles, tractors, radios. He could take a cracked engine and make it hum like gospel. But life had other ideas. Summer. A folded letter arrived from the U.S. government, with an eagle crest and cold instructions. You are hereby drafted into the United States Army. The war in Korea had begun. Another foreign battlefield, another call for bodies, and though America still denied black men full freedom, it never hesitated to send them to die for it. Elias packed what little he had and kissed his mother goodbye. She held him longer than expected, whispering a prayer that stuck to his skin. Come back whole, baby. Come back better. But the army didn't want him whole. Fort Benning, Georgia. Basic training. Segregation hadn't ended just because the uniform was green. Black recruits trained in separate barracks, ate in different mess halls, and answered to white officers who treated them as burdens. Their gear was outdated, their rations fewer, their assignments more dangerous. Elias was placed in the 92nd Infantry Division, known unofficially as the Buffalo Soldiers. The nickname carried pride in black communities, but within army walls it was often spat with contempt. The Expendables. Their drills were harsher, their punishments crueler. When Elias once corrected a white sergeant for misreading a topographic map, he was thrown into latrine duty for a week and denied hot meals. But he endured, not because he was fearless, because he'd been hardened by a country that demanded black excellence, and then punished it. It was there he met Calvin Rowe, a wiry kid from Harlem, with quick hands and quicker wit. Calvin had a laugh that could break tension like a knife slicing fog. He was the first friend Elias made in the service. His tentmate, his confidant, his brother in arms. In Korea, the war turned colder. The terrain was brutal, and so were the orders. The 92nd was routinely sent on frontline assignments. Others refused. Mine clearing, tunnel raids, enemy diversion tactics, often with limited intel and no backup. It was during one such mission that the cracks widened into a chasm. Winter. Elias and Calvin were part of a unit ordered to intercept a supposed enemy munitions cache near the Imjin River. They were given a broken compass, a single radio with no spare battery, and vague coordinates. They made contact too soon, too suddenly. It wasn't a cache. It was a trap. Gunfire erupted from the cliffs. Chinese snipers tore into their formation like lightning splitting trees. Elias radioed for backup. Again and again, the response was silence. And then, finally, a single reply. Negative. Reinforcements unavailable. Proceed as instructed. Calvin was hit in the chest. Blood poured like ink through his jacket. Elias dropped beside him, clutching his friend's hand, whispering through clenched teeth, "You hold on. You hear me. You hold." Calvin smiled weakly. "Don't let 'em write me out, Eli. Promise me they don't forget." Those were his last words. Elias carried Calvin's body back to base. Alone. 56 pounds of life turned weightless. When he arrived, the medics barely looked up. His commanding officer shrugged and logged Calvin as KIA. No further inquiry. But Elias couldn't let it rest. He pounded on the door of the officer's tent. "We asked for backup. You left us out there." Captain Daniels, young, polished, white, looked up with the same cold composure. Elias would hear again decades later. "You're not here to question protocol, Private Monroe. You're here to follow orders." Elias's fists curled, but he didn't raise them. "That boy died for a lie." Daniel stood. "And if you keep pushing, I'll make sure your whole record disappears with him." The warning was clear. Challenge the system, and the system will erase you. But Elias had already decided something. If they weren't going to save his brothers, he would. 3 days later, Elias intercepted a fragmented signal. Another platoon, black soldiers again, was trapped in the lowlands, with enemy forces closing in. The base refused to send help. "Resources stretched thin," Daniel said. "Acceptable losses." But Elias remembered Calvin's last words. "Don't let 'em write me out." So he gathered 6 men, quietly, off-grid, no orders, just they set out at dusk. What happened in those next 48 hours would become legend to the few who survived, and a secret to everyone else. Because when Elias returned, covered in ash and blood, every soldier from the trapped unit was alive. But Elias? His name wouldn't be on the medal list. Not after what Daniels did next. In a locked office, under cover of night, Captain Daniels opened Elias's service file, scribbled across it in red ink, and made a call to the Pentagon. His voice was cold, practiced. "Private Elias Monroe has gone rogue. Recommend immediate discharge for insubordination." The night was bitter, the kind of cold that cut through flesh and scraped the soul. Elias Monroe crouched behind the jagged remains of a burnt-out stone wall in the Korean countryside, peering through the gloom. His breath steamed from his lips in bursts, timed with the hammering of his heart. Snow had begun to fall again, dusting the ground with a deceptive softness. But nothing here was gentle. He signaled to the 6 men who had followed him into the dark. Unsanctioned mission. They were exhausted, half-starved, but loyal. Loyal not just to Elias, but to the truth he carried, that their lives were worth more than the silence the army kept demanding from them. Somewhere beyond the ridge lay a battered unit of black infantrymen, their distress call intercepted by Elias. The brass had labeled it a non-critical incident. No extraction, no resources. Let it burn. But Elias wouldn't. He had already buried one friend under orders and another beneath silence. He would not bury more. They moved like ghosts, slipping through trenches, weaving between gutted outposts, avoiding enemy spotters, with the precision of men who knew no cavalry was coming. The air stank of gunpowder and freezing death. In the distance he heard the staccato of distant artillery, steady like a heartbeat. Then something else. Voices. Faint, desperate. American. They were close. Elias pressed himself against the cold rock, nodded once to his team, and surged forward. What they found was worse than expected. 37 soldiers lay huddled in a collapsed ravine, hemmed in by North Korean snipers on the high cliffs. Several were wounded. A few were dying. No shelter, no ammo, no hope. But then Elias appeared, moving through enemy fire like he'd been born in its shadow. He and his men launched a makeshift assault, flanking the snipers with Molotov cocktails made from fuel canisters and rations. Smoke blanketed the field. In the confusion, they dragged the wounded out, carried bodies on their backs, shielded each other with whatever scrap of metal they could find. They didn't sleep. They didn't eat. They moved. For 32 straight hours. By the time the sun broke through the frost and lit the ravine in pale gold, every soldier was accounted for. Alive. Saved. A single radio call, traced to an open frequency, finally caught the ear of a nearby unit. Reinforcements came. Late, but enough to mop up what Elias had already bled to achieve. When they returned to base, Elias's body was failing. Shrapnel in his thigh, a dislocated shoulder, smoke in his lungs. He was barely conscious when medics dragged him inside the tent. But he lived, and so did the 37 men. No one else had cared to count. The next few days moved like fog. Elias was confined to the infirmary. A nurse came by daily to redress his wounds. An intelligence officer stopped in once, scribbled notes in silence, and left. Then for days, nothing. No ceremony, no debrief, no commendation. Just blank walls and colder silences. Until finally Captain Daniels arrived. He stepped into the infirmary tent with 2 MPs flanking him. His uniform, crisp and unblemished, glinted with fresh silver stars. The man who had once told Elias his life was a threat to order, now smiled like a politician. "Well, Private Monroe," he said, folding his arms, "you certainly made a name for yourself." Elias sat up, wincing. "Those men would have died." Daniels nodded. "Yes, and by some miracle, they didn't. But you broke protocol. I saved them. You disobeyed direct orders." Elias locked eyes with him. "Because they were wrong." Daniels's smile evaporated. "And that, Private, is where your problem lies." The next morning, Elias received his discharge papers. Dishonorable. No hearing. No appeals. Just an official line. Insubordination. Reckless endangerment. Failure to follow chain of command. His military record, once a beacon of valor, was now marred in ink that could not be erased. 3 weeks later, a front-page article in the Boston Tribune ran a story. "Heroic rescue by Captain Daniels saves dozens in Korea." The photographs showed Daniels at a press conference, medals freshly pinned, shaking hands with top generals. There was no mention of Elias Monroe, not even a footnote. When Elias returned stateside, there was no band, no family reunion, just a cold bus station in Montgomery, Alabama, and the shrill screech of brakes. He stepped off the Greyhound with a cane and a limp. His uniform was still torn at the sleeve, stained with someone else's blood. A few black folks at the station looked up, some with quiet admiration, others with resignation. A veteran was still a man in a white man's war, and Elias, marked by dishonor, had nothing to show for his pain. His parents didn't know he was coming home. His father had died of a stroke 6 months earlier, buried in an unmarked plot on land he never got to own. His mother, Sadie, had grown frail. She opened the door of their small wooden house with eyes that had seen too much. "Eli," she whispered, holding the frame as if it might fall. He stepped forward, knelt on the porch despite the pain. "I'm home, Mama." She held him long into the night, but home didn't feel like peace. It felt like exile. Word spread slowly. Some called him a hero. Others whispered about the discharge. A dishonorable tag was heavier than any truth he could offer. He tried to apply for a mechanic's license. Denied character concerns. Tried to rent a room in town. Denied no vacancies. Even the local black church, where Calvin's mother once worshipped, asked him not to speak during Sunday testimony. Might upset the white families who fund the roof repairs. So Elias did what too many did. He faded, took a job sweeping the floors of a segregated high school, spent his days cleaning up after boys who called him old man, and nights tending to his mother until she passed quietly one April morning, clutching a photograph of him in uniform. No press came when she died. No flag was folded. Just silence.
And Elias?
He packed away the medal sent to him anonymously, years later by a survivor from the rescue mission. No letter. No return address. Just the medal and a note that read, "You earned this. They just didn't want you to have it." He kept it hidden in a box beneath the floorboards, under the bed where he learned to dream. And for decades, Elias lived in the corners of America's memory. He didn't want fame. He wanted his name back, his dignity, his place in the line. But systems don't return what they've taken without demand. And Elias? He was tired of asking. Then, one ordinary morning, in a bus depot on the way to visit Calvin's grave, Elias was handed a strange envelope from a young soldier who called him Sir with reverence. Inside was a photograph of Captain Clifford Ray Daniels, receiving the Medal of Honor, dated 1 week before Elias's discharge, and scribbled on the back in ink, "They gave it to the wrong man." The photograph trembled slightly in Elias's calloused hands. The face in the picture was unmistakable. Captain Clifford Ray Daniels, grinning beneath the sheen of a Medal of Honor, flanked by generals in full dress. The American flag waved softly behind him, an emblem of lies stitched in red, white, and erasure. The photo had arrived without fanfare, slipped into an envelope by a soldier whose name Elias never caught. Just 3 words were scrawled on the back in ink, jagged and urgent. They gave it to the wrong man. Elias stood motionless inside the Montgomery bus terminal, the walls pulsing with a quiet hum of arrivals and departures. But he wasn't going anywhere. He had returned from the battlefield a decade earlier. But this photo, this quiet betrayal, wrapped in gloss, dragged him back into the war, not with bullets, but with memory. He stuffed the picture inside his coat pocket and stepped into the sunlight. Montgomery was no longer the town he remembered. But in truth it had never truly belonged to him. The red clay roads were now paved with promise, but the houses were more broken. Once thriving black neighborhoods had been strangled by redlining, zoning laws and bank restrictions that turned proud homes into crumbling shells. Grocery stores were gone, parks fenced off, schools decaying from the inside out. Elias wandered past his childhood church, now boarded up. The steeple leaned to the left, sagging like it too had grown tired of praying to a God who listened only on Sundays. He tried to rebuild. He applied for a GI loan to purchase a mechanic's garage on Monroe Street. He was denied. Insufficient service record, they told him. Dishonorable discharge disqualifies applicant. He tried again. This time, to rent a small 2-bedroom home on the east side. A white landlord looked over his application, eyes skimming Elias's brown face. "Neighborhood's not a good fit," he muttered, returning the paperwork without a signature. Even the local VA hospital turned him away from long-term care. The clerk, a young man with slicked back hair and a name tag that read Dale, smirked when Elias asked about his benefits. "Maybe if you'd followed orders, you'd qualify," he said. Elias didn't raise his voice. He just nodded, folded the rejection letter in half, and walked out. He stopped asking after the 5th rejection. Some wounds bled slower than bullets. Racism, especially when it wore suits and sat behind desks, never needed to shout. So Elias took what he could get. At 42 years old, he became the night janitor at Carver High School, the same school where he once dreamed of teaching auto mechanics, now reduced to mopping its cracked hallways in silence. The principal never learned his name. Teachers passed him like furniture. Students made jokes about the old ghost with the limp. But Elias was no ghost. He was just a man who had once held the lives of 70 men in his arms, and now held a mop like it was a cross. He worked without complaint, not because he was content, but because he didn't know what else to do. Rage, he'd learned, didn't change policy, and bitterness never paid bills. Each night, after finishing the floors, he'd retire to a 1-room apartment behind the school's gymnasium. No running water, a mattress on concrete. His only companion, a broken radio that sometimes picked up gospel stations when the weather was good. He lived like that for 30 years. 30 years of missed opportunities. 30 years of being unseen. Until one rainy October evening, everything changed. A local journalist, named Hannah Givens, had been assigned a small feature, Unsung Heroes of Montgomery, a filler piece, feel-good fluff for Veterans Day. She visited Carver High looking for retired teachers. Instead, she found Elias sweeping the auditorium, the Medal of Honor tucked discreetly beneath his coat, always with him even if no one ever asked. She almost walked past him, but something in his posture stopped her. He stood straight, movements precise, as if polishing a floor was as sacred as folding a flag. "Excuse me," she asked. "Were you in the military?" Elias looked up slowly, gaze unreadable. "Long time ago. May I ask what branch?" "Army." She smiled. "Did you see action?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he nodded toward the mop in his hand. "Not much action here. Just wax and dust." Hannah chuckled politely and began to walk away, but something nagged at her. His eyes, they carried weight. The next day, she returned with coffee and more questions. Elias didn't give her much, but he let her sit, let her talk, and eventually, let her see the medal. Her breath caught in her throat. This is real?" Elias nodded. "Got it in the mail. No speech, no salute." That night, Hannah dug through military archives. Something didn't make sense. There was no record of Elias Monroe receiving the Medal of Honor, but there was a record of Captain Clifford Ray Daniels, awarded for a Korean rescue mission in January 1951. The same timeline Elias had described. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests, sifted through declassified documents, old Army memos, witness testimonies, redacted reports. And then she found it. A sealed recommendation form, dated February 2, 1951, signed by a junior lieutenant who had since disappeared from public record. The document praised Private Elias J. Monroe for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire, detailing the rescue of 37 soldiers from behind enemy lines. Stamped on the bottom in red ink, the name listed under Commanding Officer Disapproval, Captain C.R. Daniels. Hannah returned to the school the next morning, face pale with disbelief. She stood in the hallway where Elias was sweeping, clutching the printed file in trembling hands. "You were right," she said softly. "Elias didn't turn. I found it. They buried you." "I know," he said. "No, I mean, they really buried you. They took your name off the list, gave your medal to Daniels." Elias leaned on the mop. "That's what power does." She stepped closer. "I'm going to write this. I'm going to publish it." He looked up. "You sure they'll let you?"
"I don't care."
There was a long pause. Then Elias smiled, faint, cracked, but real. "I used to think no one would ever find it," he said. "But Calvin, he told me to make sure they didn't write us out." Hannah's voice broke. "They won't. Not if I can help it." He nodded. "Then do what you need to, Miss Givens. But don't write it for me. Write it for every name they left off the page." 2 days later, as Hannah prepared her exposé, an anonymous envelope landed on her desk. Inside was a classified Army memo. Its title, Suppression of Unverified Minority Claims, Korean War Period, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense, and scrawled on the corner in pen, "Don't dig deeper. For your safety." The envelope had arrived like a warning, a silent shot across the bow. Inside, the memo was clear, its language clinical and deliberate. Suppression of Unverified Minority Claims, Korean War Period, stamped and sealed by the Department of Defense. The message, scribbled in shaky handwriting on the bottom corner, was anything but bureaucratic. "Don't dig deeper. For your safety." But Hannah Givens had already crossed that line. She stared at the document in her cramped apartment, her fingers trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prison riot. Outside, Montgomery rain tapped against the glass in rhythmic warning. Inside, Elias's face haunted her, stoic, worn, steady, a man who had survived being forgotten, erased, silenced. She owed him more than silence. She didn't go to the police. She went to the people. The next day, Hannah contacted the National Association of Black Veterans, NABV, a group long considered a watchdog for racial injustice in military history. Within 48 hours, she was sitting in a downtown DC office filled with yellowed war photos, faded campaign posters, and walls lined with files too painful to forget. The group's president, Ronald "Rocky" Henderson, a retired Marine with a silver beard and a permanent limp, listened in silence as Hannah laid out Elias's story. When she finished, he looked down at the Medal of Honor, resting on the table between them. "This," he said, voice low and deliberate, "is not rare. What they did to Elias, it's happened before. It's still happening. So what do we do?" Hannah asked. Rocky's eyes narrowed. "We fight. Not just for Elias. For every soldier buried under a flag that never gave them justice." Elias was skeptical at first. When Rocky and his legal team visited him at his tiny apartment behind Carver High, Elias offered no handshake, no smile, just the same guarded posture he'd worn since the day his discharge papers stole his dignity. "Y'all think because a few kids in suits show up with folders the Army's gonna say sorry?" Rocky met his gaze evenly. "We don't want an apology. We want a reversal." Elias stared at him a long moment, then motioned to the chair. "Sit down then." The NABV team opened a formal petition with the Department of Defense. They submitted the declassified rescue file, testimony from surviving soldiers, Hannah's exposé, and a dozen eyewitness statements. They didn't ask for a ceremony, just the truth. But the Pentagon wasn't built to move quickly, especially for black men, whose stories threatened the myth of American military perfection. The first response came 4 months later. "Insufficient documentation to verify deviation from standard protocol. Case closed." Elias read the letter in silence, his fingers folding it with the precision of a man who had read rejections his entire life. "They still scared of ghosts," he muttered. Hannah was livid. "We had documents, eyewitnesses, a damn medal." Rocky remained calm. "That was round one. We go again." The NAB escalated the case. They filed appeals. They lobbied congressional representatives. They appeared on talk shows, podcast interviews, and veterans panels. Each time Elias's name was spoken aloud, it rang like defiance in a country that had trained itself to forget men like him. Veterans from other wars began to speak up. Black Marines from Vietnam, Tuskegee Airmen families, Korean War medics. They all carried versions of Elias's pain. But with each appeal came another rejection. Evidence does not meet threshold for correction. Concerns regarding historical accuracy. Maintaining the integrity of military record-keeping. And then, in a confidential leak from an anonymous Senate staffer, Rocky learned the truth. One man was blocking the appeal. Senator Malcolm R. Travis, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. A legacy conservative from Tennessee. Travis had built his career on championing military honor and American exceptionalism. For decades, he had fought efforts to revisit old conflicts. His fear that rewriting war history would shame the uniform. In a redacted memo, Travis had written, "Allowing reversal of Elias Monroe's discharge will open a floodgate of revisionist demands. We must protect the national image and narrative of order. Recommend quiet dismissal of file." He didn't just bury Elias's past. He padlocked the future. When Hannah told Elias, he didn't flinch. "They've been guarding lies longer than I've been alive," he said softly. "But we can expose him," she argued. Elias looked out the window at a storm gathering across the Alabama sky. Even truth got a price. And that's when the next twist struck. Not from the Pentagon or the Senate, but from Elias's own body. A routine checkup. A lingering cough. Then blood. Diagnosis: Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Terminal. He sat alone in the examination room as the doctor explained the timeline. 6 months. Maybe less. Elias didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply nodded and folded the report like another rejection letter. But this one couldn't be appealed. Rocky and Hannah sat with him that evening in his apartment. The radio played softly. Mahalia Jackson's voice whispering through static. "You didn't tell us you were sick," Rocky said. "Didn't want it to matter," Elias replied. "But I guess it does now." "We can still fight," Hannah said. "We can go public with the senator's block. There are legal channels." Elias shook his head slowly. "I don't need the government to remember me. I need the next black soldier to not be forgotten." The words landed like thunder. He turned to Rocky. "Promise me. When I'm gone, don't let this die with me." Rocky nodded, voice low. "I promise." But even promises couldn't stall the ticking clock in Elias's chest. He began writing letters. Dozens of them. To veterans he had saved. To the families of the men he buried. To his brother's daughter who lived in Atlanta and had never known why Uncle Eli never spoke of the war. Each letter carried the same weight. The story they tried to silence. 3 weeks later, Hannah's expose ran on the front page of the Washington Post. The Forgotten Soldier. How the Army Erased Elias Monroe. It sparked outrage. Television anchors wept on air. Civil rights leaders demanded hearings. Veterans held candlelight vigils across the country. Social media lit up with one name, Justice for Lee. And across Capitol Hill, Senator Malcolm Travis's staff scrambled. Reporters showed up at his office demanding comment. Protesters camped outside his home. And within 48 hours, leaked emails revealed his direct interference in multiple military review cases. He had not only blocked Elias, he had built a career on burying black valor. The pressure mounted. Travis scheduled a press conference to defend his actions. But as he stepped to the podium, pale and shaking, a woman in the crowd stood up, holding a folded American flag. "I'm Calvin Rowe's sister," she said. "Elias Monroe saved my brother's life. You erased him. But I won't let you do it again." The crowd erupted, and across the country, one quiet man sat alone in his dim apartment, clutching a final letter. It was addressed to the White House. Stamped, sealed, unsent for now. The fallout from Senator Malcolm Travis's unraveling hadn't yet cooled when the next blow arrived. Not from a reporter, not from a protester, but from within the system itself. It began with a whisper. A burner email landed in Hannah Given's inbox. One cold November night. Subject line blank. Attachment encrypted. No sender. No message. Just a file labeled Operation Whitewash. Restricted. Hannah's fingers hovered over the trackpad. She'd been threatened before. She'd seen fake leads designed to discredit whistleblowers. But something about this, about its timing, its silence, felt different. She clicked. The file opened with a Department of Defense watermark and rows of redacted text. Embedded were scanned memos, internal military emails, meeting transcripts. What she read made her stomach twist. They knew. Since 1952, a covert initiative, codenamed Whitewash, had been active within the Pentagon's Historical Review Board. Its aim, to maintain narrative cohesion in the portrayal of American military heroism. Translation: ensure the Medal of Honor was awarded to those who fit the image. White, compliant, photogenic. There were references to Elias Monroe. Not by name but by mission code and location. K-447 Rescue Operation. Jan 1951. A footnote marked risk level high, recipient unfit for public image. And in the margins of one printed memo, scrawled in blue pen, were 3 damning words: too black, too loud. Hannah's breath caught. It wasn't just neglect. It was deliberate. She called Rocky. "This changes everything," she said. He met her that night, eyes narrowing as he flipped through the documents. One by one. "This ain't just about Elias," he whispered. "This is a blueprint for erasure." The documents leaked. Hannah published them in a follow-up article titled, "The Department of Disappearance, Inside the Army's Quiet Racism." The reaction was immediate. Furious. News anchors opened their broadcasts with footage of Black war heroes, whose records had been altered, buried, denied. Hashtags flooded every social platform: Black Valor buried, Honor Elias, Operation Whitewash. Families came forward. Sons of Black World War II veterans, daughters of Korean medics, grandchildren of Vietnam heroes, whose names never made it onto any memorial wall. The country's conscience, long dormant, now burned with shame. But amid the firestorm, Elias said little. He watched the news quietly from a folding chair in his apartment, hands clasped in his lap. His breathing was shallower now. The cancer had taken more from him than years. It had taken energy, appetite, the sharpness behind his stare, and still no word from Washington. Until a week before Christmas, a navy blue envelope arrived. Thick paper, gold-embossed seal. It wasn't addressed in print. It was handwritten, with reverence. Mr. Elias J. Monroe. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the corners. Inside was a letter from the office of the president. Polished, padded, unmistakably formal. "In recognition of your exemplary service and in light of newly revealed information, the President of the United States formally invites you to Washington, D.C., for a special session of the Congressional Armed Services Committee." They wanted him to speak, not just as a witness but as a symbol. Elias blinked slowly. After 70 years of silence, the most powerful office in the world had finally called his name. He looked up at Hannah, who had driven over the moment he called. "They want me to stand in front of the same government that broke me," he said. "You don't have to," she offered. But Elias shook his head. "I do." The days that followed moved like water under ice. Still on the surface, turbulent below, Hannah and Rocky began preparing him for the trip. Suit rental, medical clearance, security briefings. His body had weakened, but his voice hadn't. Each practice session was laced with pain, precision, and decades of things unsaid. Then, 3 days before the flight, another twist.
A second leak. This time from a Pentagon employee, anonymous, but detailed. It revealed that even now, internal advisors were debating whether Elias's public recognition could undermine the perception of institutional valor.
One memo, dated just 2 weeks prior, read, "Risk of precedent. If Monroe is validated, expect influx of retroactive claims. Recommend delaying recognition until posthumous stage." In other words, wait for him to die. When Rocky read it aloud, Elias let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a growl. "I ain't gonna give them that comfort," he said. And so, despite pain in his chest and weight in his bones, he boarded the plane. Not first class, not military priority. Just a seat by the window. As the plane ascended, Elias stared at the clouds, his medal tucked beneath his shirt, close to the heart that had carried it unseen for a lifetime. He didn't speak much during the flight, but when the landing gear dropped and the Capitol dome appeared through the haze, he whispered 4 words only Hannah could hear. "It ends with me." As the plane taxied to the gate, the pilot's voice broke through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to remain seated for the arrival of a very special passenger." Every head turned, and outside the window, standing on the tarmac, were 3 U.S. Marines in dress blues. Waiting. The plane door opened slowly, and for a brief moment, Elias Monroe didn't move. Not out of hesitation or fear, but something deeper. a weight that had long ago settled in his bones, now lifting in pieces too fragile to name. 3 Marines stood on the tarmac, shoulders square, uniforms immaculate. The lead officer, black, early 40s, stepped forward and saluted the frail man exiting the jet bridge. "Private Monroe," he said, voice steady. "It's an honor." Elias nodded, eyes sharp beneath drooping lids. "Took y'all long enough." The Marines chuckled gently, but not condescendingly. The remark wasn't bitter, it was honest. From the gate, passengers watched in silence as Elias was escorted to a waiting vehicle. There were no cameras, no news vans, just a few curious eyes and whispers. But in that quiet reception, a dignity pulsed stronger than any parade. The next morning, Elias stood in front of a mirror inside a modest guest suite at the Mayflower Hotel in D.C. Hannah helped button his shirt. His hands, once firm enough to carry men through mortar fire, now shook with exhaustion. "You don't have to speak if you don't want to," she said softly. "I do," he replied. "It's the only part they can't take back." At 11 a.m. sharp, he arrived at the Hall of Heroes inside the Pentagon, a room barely used, mostly ceremonial. A handful of chairs were arranged in a semicircle. No stage, no teleprompters, no orchestra or marching band. Just polished floors and walls lined with medals once worn by ghosts. 15 people were in attendance. 2 Pentagon officials. The chair of the Joint Chiefs. A single senator, not Travis, who had since resigned in disgrace, and 3 representatives from the NAAB, seated proudly in the front row. Missing were all the faces the public had hoped would attend. Most notably, the president. His absence came with a bland statement to the press. Scheduling conflicts prevent attendance, but the commander-in-chief honors Mr. Monroe in spirit. There were no flags at half-mast, no national anthem, just a slow shuffle to the podium, where a decorated army general with silver hair read a speech that sounded like it had been written by someone who had never met Elias. "Today we correct a mistake. Today we honor valor, unrecognized for far too long." It was less a celebration and more an obligation. A box finally ticked. Elias didn't smile when they called his name. He stood, accepted the small velvet box, and looked the general square in the eye. "Better late than never," he said, voice gravelly but clear. The general nodded uncomfortably. "We are grateful for your service, Private Monroe." Elias stepped away from the podium. He turned to the guests, then paused. His eyes scanned the room, not for applause but for absence. For who should have been there, for who never would be. He cleared his throat and spoke. "I was given this medal today because someone finally told the truth. But I want you to know, I didn't come here for applause." He opened the box. The Medal of Honor gleamed beneath the lights. "I came here to remind you that it's possible to be brave and black, and still be buried by silence." A hush fell over the room. "I fought in a war that didn't want me. Saved men who forgot my name. Buried brothers no one claimed. And then I came home to a country that asked me to mop floors instead of tell my story." His voice didn't tremble. It cut. "For 70 years, this medal sat in a desk drawer in someone else's office. And now they're giving it back like it's forgiveness." He closed the box and tucked it inside his coat. "This doesn't undo what was done, but maybe, just maybe, it stops it from happening again." There was no standing ovation, no orchestra swell, just silence. Then a single tear rolled down the cheek of the general. Elias saw it, nodded once, and returned to his chair. The ceremony ended within 30 minutes. No journalists waited outside. No headlines broke. That night, Elias declined dinner invitations. He returned to his hotel room alone. He placed the medal on the desk and stared at it. The gold shimmered faintly. The blue ribbon curled slightly at the edges. He reached out, ran a finger along its edge. Not with awe, but with familiarity. He had worn it once in blood. Then, slowly, he folded it back into its box and placed it in the lining of his suitcase beneath a stack of old clothes. Not because he didn't value it, but because he didn't trust what it meant in the hands of the wrong people. When he returned to Montgomery, no parade awaited him. The school where he once mopped floors gave him a framed certificate and a handshake. A local paper ran a story on page 9. Local veteran finally recognized. But Elias didn't need headlines. He walked his neighborhood streets like he always had. Slowly, deliberately, with eyes wide open. He sat on his porch every morning, watching the buses roll by. Sometimes people waved. Sometimes they didn't. The medal remained hidden. Not locked in a vault. Not mounted on a wall. but buried deep in an old cigar box beneath the floorboards of his living room, next to letters from Calvin Rowe and a photo of the men he had saved. For 15 years, no one saw it again. Children grew up, administrations changed, streets were renamed. But Elias? He kept sweeping his porch, rocking in his chair, and praying with eyes open. Until one humid spring afternoon, a knock came at his door. It wasn't a neighbor, it wasn't a friend, it was a soldier, young, black uniform, crisp, eyes full of fire. "Mr. Monroe?" the young man asked. Elias nodded. "That's me." The soldier stepped forward and held out a single folded paper. "This is from the Department of Defense. They're reviewing all Medal of Honor cases involving racial bias. They've reopened your file." Elias didn't move. The soldier hesitated. "Sir, they're asking if you'll testify." Elias tilted his head slightly, then smiled, small, tired, but defiant. "After all this time, they still need my voice?" "Yes, sir." Elias nodded slowly, tapping the arm of his chair. "Then let's give it to them." Later that night, as Elias prepared to dust off the medal, he noticed something strange, a second ribbon tucked beneath the original medal in the box. Attached was a note in neat handwriting. "This belonged to Calvin. He deserved it too. Found it in the archives. Thought you should have it. No name, no return address." The morning sun had barely risen over Montgomery when Elias Monroe stepped into the airport terminal. The glass doors whooshed shut behind him, and a cool wave of air swept over his worn coat. The hum of coffee machines, the distant crackle of overhead announcements, and the sharp drag of suitcase wheels filled the space with motion. But Elias moved slowly, deliberately. His steps were no longer quick, but each one grounded by purpose. His fingers gripped the leather handle of his small, faded duffel bag, a companion older than some of the TSA officers who would soon scrutinize him. Inside that bag were only essentials: a folded black suit for Nathaniel Brooks' funeral, a weathered Bible with handwritten notes from the 1950s, and a velvet box he hadn't opened in months. The Medal of Honor stayed buried beneath the fabric, not because he was ashamed, but because he was tired of what followed when people saw it. The funeral had come suddenly. Nathaniel, his last surviving brother-in-arms, had passed in his sleep, 73 years after Korea, and the war still pulled its soldiers home one by one. Elias had made a promise back then, in a frozen trench soaked with gunpowder and blood. "If one of us makes it back before the other, we send him off ourselves." And Elias kept his promises. He arrived early, ticket in hand, seat reserved. Security was quieter than usual. Fewer people, fewer eyes. Still, some watched him. A woman with frosted highlights pulled her child closer as he approached the screening area. An older man in a sports jacket frowned at Elias's duffel. Another whispered something into a companion's ear, barely audible, but heavy with assumption. Elias didn't react. He knew the language of stares. He'd been fluent since. At the TSA checkpoint, he removed his shoes with careful hands, placed the bag into the bin, and stepped into the scanner. Beep. "Sir, please step back," the officer said, firm but clipped. Elias obeyed. The machine buzzed again on the second attempt. "Sir, spread your arms." The pat-down was mechanical, impersonal, but Elias could feel the tension rising behind it. The way the second agent, blonde, square-jawed, early 30s, watched him. Like he wasn't just screening for contraband. Like he was waiting for an excuse. The lead agent opened the duffel. Folded suit, medication, Bible. Then, the metal box. She paused. "What's this?" Elias answered quietly. "A memory." She opened it, brows furrowed. Her eyes widened. Her partner stepped closer, squinting at the contents. "You carry this around?" he asked. Elias didn't blink. "I've carried it longer than you've been alive." The agent's voice sharpened. "It's just unusual. We don't see these often." "No," Elias said. "You don't." The younger officer returned, speaking into an earpiece. "We've got a security ping flagged file, former military, dishonorable tag," then corrected. The lead agent turned. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us for additional screening." Elias looked at her. Steady. "You think I'm a threat?" "It's protocol." "Is it?" he asked, voice even. "Or is it just tradition in a new uniform?" Her eyes flickered. Around them, travelers began to slow. "Watch." Whispers moved like electricity. "Just come with us, sir. We'll sort it out quickly." Elias stood still for a long breath. "Every time I walk into a space they told me I've earned, I end up answering for why I'm there. The male officer stepped forward. Sir, now. Elias lifted the bag slowly. The metal rested on top now, visible, shining under fluorescent lights like an accusation. They led him away. In the back room, the walls were white. The air smelled like toner and power. They asked questions. He answered them. They verified his ID, called a number. The minutes dragged, but Elias sat still, eyes locked on nothing. Not in fear, not in anger, in fatigue. He remembered another interrogation decades ago. A younger officer, a harder accusation. Same silence. Finally, the agent returned. Mr. Monroe, you're cleared. Sorry for the delay. Of course, Elias said. They offered a bottle of water. He declined. You understand, sir. It was just an automated flag military discharge coding from years ago. It shouldn't have popped up. Elias stood slowly, bones aching. It always pops up. In airports. In offices. In classrooms. You can scrub the code from the screen, but not from the way you look at me. Neither agent responded. When he re-entered the terminal, the scene had shifted. Someone had filmed the incident. The clip was already viral. Veteran detained for carrying Medal of Honor. Read the caption under shaky footage of Elias being led away. By the time he reached gate B27, people stood and clapped quietly. Not all, but enough. A teenage girl offered her seat. A middle-aged man handed him a coffee without asking what he liked. But Elias didn't drink it. He sat in silence. The duffel still on his lap. The medal still resting on top. The gate agent walked over. Mr. Monroe? He nodded. You've been upgraded. To where? Presidential class. Straight through to Baltimore. With escort. Elias furrowed his brow. Escort? She handed him an envelope. The seal read, Office of the President. He opened it slowly. Inside, a brief letter typed but signed in ink. Mr. Monroe, we regret what happened this morning. Your legacy is known. Your dignity is yours. Please accept this upgrade as a small gesture of respect. We would like to meet you upon your return. POTUS. He folded the letter carefully. Not with excitement, but with the same precision he had folded the flag over too many coffins. Just as boarding began, a new notification lit up the terminal screens. Security alert. Passenger Elias Monroe. Flagged for secondary clearance. Again. And this time 2 federal agents stepped into the gate, hands already on radios. The alert echoed across the gate's loudspeakers like a bolt of lightning cracking the air. Security alert. Passenger Elias Monroe. Flagged for secondary clearance. Passengers fell silent. The tension that had begun to settle now surged like a tide. Heads turned toward gate B27. Phones were already in hand. 2 federal agents walked briskly through the gate, earpieces in place, radios clipped tight to their shoulders. Their expressions were rehearsed, stone-faced neutrality, but their presence was unmistakable. This wasn't a protocol check. It was an escalation. Elias didn't flinch. He remained seated near the window, hands folded over his cane, duffel on his lap. The velvet metal box still peeked from inside. His name was being called again. Not as a hero, but as a problem. One of the agents stopped 5 feet away. Mr. Monroe? Yes, Elias said evenly. We've been informed of a persistent data flag on your military file. We need to ask you to accompany us for clarification. Elias's shoulders straightened. You already cleared me once. The agent hesitated. We understand, sir, but there's been a directive from Homeland's internal database. Until it's resolved, a voice interrupted from behind. Why? Why are you still bothering him? Everyone turned. It was a teenage boy, 17 at most, wiry, clutching a cracked iPhone in both hands. His voice cracked slightly, but his words were steady. I filmed everything earlier, he said, and I'm filming this too. You can't keep dragging this man off like he's dangerous. He's a veteran. He's got a Medal of Honor, for God's sake. The agent stiffened. We're following standard. No, you're following bias. The teen snapped. Someone clapped. Then another. Soon murmurs of agreement grew louder around the terminal. More phones came out. Red lights blinked. Live streams opened. Elias slowly stood. Let them film. Let the world see how a medal doesn't stop a man from being profiled. The agents exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping in. The gate agent reappeared, phone in hand, whispering urgently to the federal officers. There's been a correction, she said, voice lowered. The flag was outdated. Someone just called from DC. It's been overridden. From where in DC? One agent asked. She looked down. The office of the First Lady. A beat passed. Then, reluctantly, the agents nodded. Mr. Monroe, you're free to board. We apologize for the confusion. But it was too late for that, because the teenager's video, rough, unfiltered, emotional, was already live. The first clip had shown Elias being led away by TSA. The second now showed him surrounded again, this time by federal officers, with a Medal of Honor visible on his lap. The video exploded. Within an hour, it had 400,000 views on Twitter. By the time Elias's plane landed in Baltimore, the count had crossed 3 million. The hashtags returned like thunder. Justice for Elias. Still not safe. Hero flag. News outlets picked it up. First the local ones. Then CNN, MSNBC. Even international platforms carried the headline. Medal of Honor recipient mistaken as threat. Twice. In the clip, Elias's voice had been clear. Every time I walk into a space they told me I've earned, I end up answering for why I'm there. Commentators replayed it over and over. Activists referenced it in speeches. Veterans groups across the country released statements of outrage. But not everyone was outraged. The TSA staff member, involved in the original screening, a man named Garrett Lasky, appeared on a local talk show 2 days later. Dressed in his uniform, shoulders stiff, he sat across from a well-known conservative anchor who framed the segment with theatrical neutrality. Garrett, were you aware that the man you were screening was a Medal of Honor recipient? No, Lasky said flatly. And frankly, it wouldn't have changed the protocol. He triggered the scanner. We had to check his bag. It was just routine. But do you regret how it played out? The anchor asked. Lasky hesitated. Look, I wasn't rude. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't know who he was. How is that my fault? Online backlash erupted. His response lacked remorse. Lacked humanity. A split screen of Elias being surrounded and Lasky defending it played across millions of devices. On the View, a veteran co-host fought back tears. This is what systemic erasure looks like, she said. Elias Monroe is a living embodiment of America's sins and silence, and we're still treating him like he's dangerous. In Baltimore, Elias never watched the coverage. He attended Nathaniel's funeral quietly, delivered a short eulogy, and placed a folded flag over the coffin with trembling hands. His voice cracked just once when he said, "You got there first, Nate, but I didn't forget." Afterward, he returned to his hotel, sat quietly on the edge of the bed, and wept. Not just for Nathaniel, but for the confirmation that no medal, no matter how rare, could protect a black man from being unseen. 2 nights later, something unexpected happened. A tech-savvy journalist reviewing the viral video frame by frame noticed something strange, something hidden in plain sight. At the 0138 timestamp, as Elias was being questioned, the camera caught the reflection in a nearby window, and in that reflection was a TSA supervisor, in the background, on a phone. The video zoomed in, enhanced. He wasn't just watching. He was smiling, and mouthing 2 words, barely visible, but readable. Got him. The frame went viral next. Suddenly, it wasn't just about protocol or misunderstanding. It was about intent. News broke the next morning. The supervisor, Martin Krell, had previously worked in a military base, where he'd been reprimanded for racial bias. His file showed multiple internal complaints, all quietly settled. He had remained at TSA without consequence, until now. Congressional leaders called for an investigation. Civil rights lawyers opened a case, and a public hearing was scheduled to examine racial bias in federal security screenings, using Elias Monroe as the central example. Elias received a phone call from a restricted number the next morning. When he answered, the voice was low, almost strained. "This is General Halstead from the Pentagon."
Yes?
Elias replied. "I just thought you should know. We've received a subpoena." "For what?" "For every Medal of Honor file reviewed between 19... A pause. "And Elias," the general said quietly, "your name's not the only one missing." The phone call from General Halstead rang like a bell inside Elias Monroe's chest long after he hung up. Your name's not the only one missing. He had spent his life believing his erasure was singular, personal, a cruel, pointed injustice carved into his file and left to fester. But now, the truth cut deeper. He wasn't alone. He was part of a system, a design engineered to bury valor when it came with black skin. And suddenly, the silence of 70 years wasn't just an absence of recognition. It was a conspiracy. The story broke wide within days. Hannah Givens, working with whistleblowers and military historians, published a full-length investigative feature in The Atlantic titled The Hidden Roll Call: Black Heroes the Nation Forgot. In it, she detailed how thousands of war files had been altered, misfiled, or lost between 1949 and 1980 years that encompassed the Korean War, Vietnam, and the tail end of World War II. Her findings revealed something staggering. Over 170 documented black soldiers had been recommended for the Medal of Honor. Fewer than 10 had received it. The rest? Their names faded beneath red tape, clerical denials, and phrases like unverified conduct or insufficient records. And Elias Monroe's name, once a ghost in the footnotes, now sat at the center. The story wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. Across the country, black veterans came forward. A Vietnam scout from Memphis named Reggie Smoke Hall, who had pulled 5 men from a flaming tank, but was discharged for disobedience. A Korean War medic named Thomas Ayers, who lost his leg in a mortar blast while shielding a child, only to return home and be denied veteran benefits because of a character mark that was never explained. A pilot named Emmanuel Torch Willis, who flew over 30 combat missions in Vietnam, and was never promoted because he had once spoken too passionately in a debriefing. They came forward not for revenge, but for recognition, for their names to matter, for the silence to end. Elias watched the news each evening from his living room, the metal box now resting atop the mantel. His name was finally being spoken. Not as a threat, not as a question, but as a measure of what had been lost, and what needed to be restored. Networks ran specials with titles like Valor Buried, The Other Side of the Medals, America's Forgotten Soldiers. They played black and white footage of Elias in his 20s, still photos from his military file. His voice, gravelly and slow, echoed across segments. They tried to make me invisible, but I survived. And I remember everything. The Medal of Honor, once gleaming on podiums, centered on clean uniforms, became a conversation piece across the country. People no longer looked at it the same. In barbershops in Detroit, churches in Birmingham, classrooms in New York, conversations emerged. The medal had become a symbol, not just of bravery, but of silence, of what it meant when valor had a color. In one viral video, a young boy in Baltimore stood before his 5th grade class, holding a printout of Elias's picture. "This is what a hero looks like," he said, and they almost made us forget him. The White House could no longer remain quiet. Public pressure mounted. Veterans organizations staged candlelight vigils. Petitions circled with millions of signatures demanding review of all Medal of Honor cases involving black soldiers. The Department of Defense released a statement. "We are opening a full-scale review of all military award recommendations, with respect to race-related discrepancies." But it wasn't enough. The public wanted action. So, for the first time in U.S. history, a congressional joint session was scheduled to address racial bias in military commendations. And they wanted Elias Monroe to testify. Elias didn't speak much in the days leading up to the session. He sat on his porch in the Alabama humidity, watching as news vans lined the street, waiting. Neighbors who once waved cautiously now brought him pies, flowers, letters from grandchildren who had learned about him in history class. The porch had once been his hiding place. Now it was a monument. On the morning of the hearing, a car arrived. Black, government-issued. Inside, a military escort waited, white gloves pressed neatly on his lap. Elias dressed slowly. Black suit, crisp tie, and the medal, this time worn openly across his chest. The box remained home, the memory he carried. In the car, Hannah sat beside him. "You okay?" she asked gently. Elias stared out the window. "I was a ghost for so long I forgot what it felt like to take up space." She reached for his hand. He let her hold it. The chamber was packed. Veterans, journalists, politicians, children who had never seen a war, and elders who had survived 3. The air crackled with something between reverence and rage. Elias stepped up to the podium slowly. No papers, no notes, just memory. "My name is Elias James Monroe. I was drafted in 1950. Fought in Korea. I saved lives. I buried brothers. I was awarded the Medal of Honor 70 years too late." Silence gripped the room. "But I'm not the only one. And I don't want to be the last." He paused, voice steady but weary. "For every man who came home and never heard thank you. For every mother who got a folded flag but never the full story. This moment is not about medals. It's about memory." Cameras flashed. Some wept. I don't want pity. I want accountability. He turned to the crowd. Fix it. And then, he stepped down. A standing ovation followed. Not choreographed. Not forced. Just people. Finally seeing someone who had always been there. That evening, Congress voted unanimously to open a full investigation. But behind closed doors, a senior staffer handed a sealed envelope to the Speaker of the House. Inside, a classified list of over 300 names flagged for suppression. At the top, Elias Monroe, and scribbled beside it, asset monitored, do not elevate to martyr status. Someone hadn't gotten the message, or they had and were preparing for something worse. In the aftermath of Elias Monroe's historic testimony, the Capitol halls felt different. Not quieter, just heavier. As if the very walls were trying to absorb the weight of what had been said. Every corner seemed to echo with the sentence that cracked America's facade wide open. This moment is not about medals. It's about memory. The headlines had been relentless. Congressional staffers worked through the night. Journalists camped outside government buildings. Veterans groups mobilized faster than lawmakers could issue statements. And beneath it all, a tide was shifting, not just of outrage, but of resolve. America had been moved before, by protests, by scandals. But this was revelation tethered to undeniable proof. Paper trails, testimonies, leaked memos. A man who had been discarded now stood as the undeniable proof of a system built to forget. Just 8 days after the joint session, Congress passed an emergency resolution to introduce the Racial Equity in Military Recognition Act. A bipartisan initiative, an unthinkable feat only months ago. The bill demanded a full racial audit of all military awards given between 1941 and 1980, beginning with the Medal of Honor. It also mandated the formation of an independent historical review board composed of veterans, historians, civil rights scholars, and military legal experts. The official purpose? To ensure no act of heroism was denied recognition on the basis of race. Unofficially, everyone knew the bill had one name etched into its spine: Elias J. Monroe. The president signed it on live television, flanked by black veterans from every generation. But Elias didn't attend the signing. Instead, he returned to Washington for a second round of testimony, this time before the House Oversight Committee. It wasn't a speech. It was a hearing, and the questions were harder. Mr. Monroe, a young congresswoman from Texas, asked, "Did you ever believe someone inside the Department of Defense made the decision to suppress your recognition based solely on your race?" Elias didn't blink. "I don't believe it," he said. "I know it. I lived it." Another representative leaned forward, voice cautious. "When you returned from Korea, did any official ever offer you explanation? Any justification?" Elias shook his head. "They offered me a mop." There was no applause this time. Only silence. The kind that throbbed like a bruise. Midway through the hearing, the unexpected happened. Retired General Halford Creston, a decorated white veteran who once served on the Pentagon's Military Awards Board, requested to speak. His presence sent murmurs through the chamber. Known for his cold efficiency, Creston had never spoken publicly about racial disparities. No one expected him to appear, let alone testify. He stood slowly, holding a cane with trembling hands. "I've come to tell the truth," he said, his voice brittle but loud. "I served on that board in 1972. I saw the Monroe file. I saw the citation. I read the eyewitness accounts." He paused. "And I signed the rejection form." Gasps rippled through the gallery. "I was told to keep the standards clean, that this medal would open the floodgates. I was young. I obeyed. But I knew what it was. We all did." "Was it racism, General?" one representative asked. Creston didn't flinch. "It wasn't just racism," he said. "It was policy. We weren't correcting records. We were curating narratives." Elias stared at him from across the room. For once someone had said it aloud. On record. On television. The lie had a witness. The committee room went still. The moment suspended in collective disbelief. In the days that followed, public support for the racial equity audit soared. But with momentum came resistance. Old power structures don't break easily. They bend, recoil, fight in shadows. And soon, Elias began receiving strange mail again. Unsigned postcards. Messages typed in caps lock. "Why are you stirring the past? Real heroes don't need spotlights. Don't become a martyr, Elias." But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Because something else was happening. Something deeper than threats. Other names were surfacing. Within the audit's first few weeks, 27 previously suppressed citations were recovered. Men who had died believing they'd never been seen. Families who had kept uniforms folded in boxes. Medals never earned but legacies never forgotten. A woman named Gloria Rowe, niece of Calvin Rowe, the friend Elias had held as he died in Korea, was contacted by the review board. Calvin had been nominated for a Bronze Star. It was buried, unsigned. She received it on a rainy Tuesday in a courthouse lobby, clutching it like an heirloom made of apology. But amid the victories, the country hadn't forgotten the footage. The teenager's video, the one that started the airport firestorm, still echoed. And now, under congressional pressure, the Department of Homeland Security had begun its own inquiry into the incident. Elias didn't want revenge, but justice, even in small echoes, still mattered. So when he was informed that one of the TSA staffers who had initially screamed at him in the VIP line months ago, the one who shouted "You don't belong here," was under investigation, he nodded quietly. That man, Garrett Lasky, had been placed on administrative leave. Now, the Oversight Committee wanted more. They wanted testimony. They issued a subpoena. As the notice was delivered, Lasky wasn't home. He had resigned from TSA, moved out of state, changed his number. But as the courier left, a neighbor stepped outside and said something chilling. He left in a rush, said something about old war files, and someone watching him said they were coming for him next. When the subpoena reached Garrett Lasky's mailbox, he was already gone. The house he'd rented in a quiet suburb outside Atlanta stood empty. No forwarding address, no goodbye. The neighbors remembered a U-Haul arriving in the early morning. One of them, a retired pastor, recalled Garrett saying something odd before leaving. "They found my file. They know now everything I buried." For weeks he'd been a ghost, but ghosts have a way of resurfacing when the truth calls them by name. It was a rainy afternoon when Garrett finally appeared, unannounced, at the office of the Congressional Committee reviewing military racial injustice. He wore jeans and a hoodie, no badge, no TSA uniform. His face was pale, jaw clenched like he hadn't slept. "I got your letter," he said to the receptionist. "I'll talk. But I want it off the record first." He wasn't offered that option. Cameras rolled as Garrett Lasky took the stand days later. Public interest was ravenous. His image had been shared across every major network. The man who barked at a black war hero in a VIP line, unaware or indifferent to the legacy that stood in front of him. He sat in a navy suit too big for his frame, fingers trembling as he adjusted the microphone. He looked older than his 32 years. The room was quiet. Elias Monroe sat in the first row, his posture straight, his eyes unblinking. The committee chair leaned forward. "Mr. Lasky, do you understand why you're here?" Garrett nodded. "Yes, sir. Please begin." "I was born in 1993 in Bartow County, Georgia. My dad ran a car dealership. My mom was a substitute teacher. We weren't rich, but we were proud. Proud of our town. Proud of the flag." He paused. "And proud of the version of America we were taught." He looked down, swallowing hard. "My house wasn't cross-burning racist. No one wore hoods. But my dad used to say things like, 'Those people get enough already.' My granddad called the civil rights movement a messy mistake. I was told that black folks were angry for no reason, that they didn't work hard, that they didn't respect rules." Gasps moved through the gallery. Not for shock, but for recognition. Garrett continued, voice tightening. "When I joined TSA, I was trained to assess threat levels, and though they never said it aloud, I knew what that meant. A young black man with a hoodie, watch him. A Middle Eastern name, flag it. An old black man in VIP, probably doesn't belong." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I saw Elias Monroe in that line, and thought he's out of place. That's what my instinct said. But my instincts were never mine. They were inherited, fed to me by a system that disguised racism as procedure." Silence gripped the room. The chair asked, "So when you yelled 'You don't belong here,' what were you reacting to?" Garrett hesitated. "My training, my upbringing, my fear of being wrong and my assumption that I was right, and my blindness." He turned toward Elias for the first time. "I didn't know you were a veteran. I didn't know your name. But that shouldn't have mattered." Elias didn't move. Garrett's voice cracked. "I'm not proud of what I said. I didn't think I was racist. But racism isn't always screaming slurs. Sometimes, it's the quiet belief that someone isn't who they say they are." The room sat heavy with conflicting emotions. Some saw honesty. Others saw a plea for forgiveness built on excuses. The debate spilled into headlines. Can you unlearn racism? Is apology enough? Lasky's testimony, redemption or deflection? One panelist on cable news said, "We can't keep accepting 'I didn't know' as an excuse. Ignorance is not innocence." Another countered, "If we punish everyone who was raised in a broken system, who's left to repair it?" Social media fractured. Some argued for empathy. He showed up. He told the truth. That's more than most. Others responded, Elias showed up for his country in 1951. Where was Garrett then? Elias said nothing publicly for 3 days. Then a reporter caught him leaving a VA clinic and asked, "Mr. Monroe, do you believe Garrett Lasky should be forgiven?" He stopped, hand on the cane, eyes unreadable. "I believe in justice," he said. "Forgiveness is earned, not owed." But inside, Elias wrestled with something deeper. Not rage, not vengeance, but weariness. He had carried the burden of silence for 70 years. And now, the man who had tried to humiliate him stood exposed, trembling in front of the nation, asking not for sympathy, but for the chance to change. That night, Elias wrote something down, folded it, placed it in an envelope, addressed to the House committee. The next morning, they opened it on live television. The letter was short. "I do not excuse what Garrett Lasky did, but I also know that hate doesn't die when it's punished. It dies when it's understood. If accountability leads to awareness, and awareness leads to action, then I will stand beside him at the next hearing. Not for him, but for every boy who's still learning what justice really looks like." The room erupted. At the next public session, Elias arrived early. Garrett stood beside him, silent, humbled. But just before they entered, a congressional aide rushed to the chair with a classified folder. She whispered urgently, eyes wide. Inside, an unsealed document from the Department of Defense. A second Medal of Honor recommendation. Not for Elias, but for Calvin Rowe. Buried, forgotten, now exposed. And scribbled across the cover in red ink. Award not approved. Reasons classified. The sky over Washington was slate gray the morning Elias Monroe walked onto the stage. It was Veterans Day, a national holiday. But this year the ceremony had a sharper edge. Not just a celebration of valor, but a reckoning with forgotten ones. Folded into the schedule between military flyovers and speeches by high-ranking officials was a name most Americans now knew, Elias J. Monroe. He had been invited to speak at the National Black Veterans Tribute, hosted on the National Mall. A stage was built near the Lincoln Memorial. Rows of folding chairs filled with aging heroes, grandchildren in pressed suits, and journalists armed with questions they never thought they'd ask. Elias stood just left of the podium, leaning slightly on his cane. He wore the Medal of Honor pinned to his chest, but not front and center. Instead, he wore it like memory, respected, but never boastful. In his other hand, he carried something new, a velvet box, smaller than the one holding his medal, lighter but no less sacred. As the announcer finished his introduction, applause erupted. But Elias didn't move right away. He waited, letting the energy settle. Then, with slow but determined steps, he approached the microphone. He didn't begin with thanks. He began with names: Calvin Rowe, Emmanuel Willis, Thomas Ayers, Reggie Hall, Elias James Monroe. These aren't just soldiers. These are echoes. The crowd quieted immediately. For 70 years, I was told silence was survival. That to remember my service was to reopen wounds no one wanted to see. But silence didn't protect us. It buried us. Elias scanned the sea of faces. Black veterans nodding slowly, sons clutching old photographs, daughters pressing tissues to their cheeks. They called me a threat in the airport. They flagged me for daring to wear my own country's honor. But I stood still, because I knew my presence was louder than their suspicion. A ripple of affirmation passed through the crowd. Elias paused, then placed the velvet box on the podium. I've been asked what justice looks like when the past can't be rewritten. The truth is, medals don't undo pain. Tributes don't restore time. But what we can give each other, what they never gave us, is acknowledgement. He opened the box. Inside was a bronze circle. 2 hands engraved, one reaching down, the other up. The forgiveness medal. This isn't about forgetting. It's not about excusing. It's about refusing to carry hate so heavy it turns into silence. He took a slow breath. I want to forgive Garrett Lasky. Gasps murmured across the crowd. Not because he deserves it. Not because he asked for it. But because I'm tired. Because I can't build a future with clenched fists. The emotion hit like a storm. Some stood. Others wept. The truth wasn't in the grandeur. It was in the restraint. I built this medal not for soldiers. Not for saints. But for those willing to admit they were wrong. For those brave enough to face the history they helped write. And rewrite it. He held the medal high. This is for those who will teach the next generation not just how to salute, but how to repair. Then, quieter. Because we don't need more monuments. We need mirrors. The silence that followed felt holy. Later that afternoon, Elias sat quietly in a reception hall near the mall. The event was winding down. Flags were folded. Camera crews packed their gear. Outside, the crowd still lingered, chanting his name. He didn't notice. His hand trembled slightly as he sipped water. The air inside the hall was too warm, but he hadn't said anything. He didn't want attention. He wanted reflection. Hannah sat beside him, concerned. You all right? He nodded slowly. Just tired. But it's a good kind of tired. She smiled.
You changed something today.
He looked at her, eyes glassy. It's not about changing the world, Hannah. Just making it harder for them to lie about it. She took his hand, held it gently. You did that. He smiled faintly. Then maybe I can rest. An hour later, in his hotel room, Elias stood before the mirror. The suit jacket was off. His tie loosened. He held the forgiveness medal in his palm like a coin from the past and future all at once. He whispered something under his breath. A name. Calvin. And then he collapsed. The sound was quiet. A body kneading carpet with the softness of surrender. The hotel staff wouldn't find him for another 20 minutes. His pulse was faint, his body weak, but the medal remained clenched in his palm, unbroken. As paramedics lifted Elias onto the stretcher, one noticed something sticking out of his coat pocket. A folded sheet of paper. The heading read, Request for Presidential Review, Calvin Rowe, Medal of Honor. Signed at the bottom, Elias J. Monroe. Dated, that very morning. Elias Monroe's heart gave out 3 days after he collapsed in that Veterans Day hotel room. 2 days before Christmas, his death was quiet, almost peaceful, surrounded by Hannah, one of the NABV board members, and his legal aid, his hand loosely closed around the request he had drafted for Calvin Rowe's Medal of Honor. He passed away without pain, but with a purpose accomplished. As the monitors flatlined, Hannah leaned down and whispered in his ear, Your fight won't end with you. She didn't realize how literal those words would soon become. In the following week, news of Elias's death spread as if the world had lost its moral center. Condolences erupted globally, flags at half-staff, memorial notices in major newspapers, and interviews with veterans who'd seen him testify, seen him stand for justice. His funeral was held in Montgomery. Soldiers and civilians filled the church pews 3 times over. A black preacher spoke of honor and broken promises. A young soldier played taps under a crisp gray sky, and Hannah read aloud the letter Elias had written, the one that requested Calvin Rowe's recognition and suggested the forgiveness medal for those willing to speak truth. At the cemetery, Hannah placed both medals together on his casket. The original Medal of Honor gleamed at the top. The forgiveness medal just beneath it. 2 symbols for 2 fights. One earned through valor, the other through grace. A gun salute echoed. A final roll of drums resonated through the silent crowd, and the church bells tolled. Elias's name had been denied time and again, but not anymore. Weeks later, Montgomery Regional Airport quietly held a ceremony. No flashy banners, no media frenzy, just a dignified small gathering of airport staff, veterans, Lolita Henderson, a former TSA director, and a lone teenage boy who had filmed that first injustice. The VIP lounge, once a symbol of exclusion, became a symbol of belonging. They unveiled a polished plaque above the entrance. Elias J. Monroe VIP Lounge. In honor of courage, justice, and dignity. At the sound of the unveiling, senior staff members paused. A gesture of recognition, not just for airline status, but for humanity restored. The teens who gathered clapped, some in tears, some with quiet pride. The plaque spoke louder than any promise ever could. A plaque doesn't erase racism, but it marks what happens when society chooses to remember. Meanwhile, at military academies and ROTC programs across the country, the story of Elias Monroe became required reading, not as an afterthought but as a central module taught in mandatory ethics classes, alongside Arlington's Arlington West lessons. In classrooms from West Point to Texas A&M, cadets examined firsthand how bias had tarnished valor, how bureaucracy had silenced black sacrifice, and how one man's refusal to stay silent sparked a national reckoning. A professor in Kansas remarked in an interview, Elias Monroe didn't just earn a medal. He returned the soul of the military. Cadets took notes, disputed, cried, debated. Above all, they listened. The ripple effects weren't contained to flags and curricula. The Department of Defense completed its racial equity audit within 6 months. In that report, dozens of previously hidden awards were reversed. Calvin rose among them. His Medal of Honor was approved posthumously. The ceremony was held at Arlington with a military escort, attended by Elias's niece, Gloria Rowe. Families of newly recognized veterans received letters, medals, and apologies from commanders whose names would never grace newspapers. The policy shifted, the historical record was rewritten, and archives opened. Yet even as change took shape, conscience shook. Late one night, 2 years later, on the anniversary of Elias's death, a figure walked up to his grave in Montgomery National Cemetery. It was Lolita Henderson, aging TSA director who had overseen the investigation into the terminal incident. She stood before the marker, her uniform creased but her posture uncertain. She held the forgiveness medal, still glimmering but worn at the edges. "I failed you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "I could have stopped them. I could have changed it." She knelt, pressing the forgiveness medal between Elias's name and the dates. "I want to teach them. I want to teach them not to do what I let happen." She smoothed the soil, as if that would rewrite her past. "I'm sorry." Earlier that day, Hannah had received an unmarked envelope with a single grainy photo inside. She recognized the badge, Garrett Lasky's TSA ID. He was standing stiff-shouldered at a new security checkpoint in Charlotte, not Montgomery. No name tag, no acknowledgement of his past, no restitution. It meant that even forgiveness wasn't an endpoint for some, it was the beginning of a journey most would never see. Back at the airport lounge named in his honor, a young black veteran paused by the plaque, fingers tracing Elias's name. In his other hand was a letter addressed to Sir. Elias's granddaughter had sent it on his birthday. Inside were 3 lines only. "I'm ready to start." If Elias Monroe's story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something deeper about justice, memory, and what true honor looks like, then don't let it stop here. Share this story with someone who still believes silence is survival. Like the video if you believe forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel if you want more powerful stories that uncover hidden truths, challenge injustice, and celebrate voices that